Anyone who reads much of the Bible at all encounters the stories or narratives of the Torah and the Gospels. So let's begin by talking about how the Bible communicates theology through narrative. As heirs of the Western intellectual tradition, we're accustomed to encountering ideas presented in the form of logical argumentation. That's why it seems most natural for us to encounter or express serious theological ideas in the form that we typically encounter them in St. Paul's letters in the New Testament. It's not that we don't understand that it's possible to communicate serious ideas through narrative. It's just that the ideas we typically associate with narrative are ideas about right and wrong, ideas about how people should conduct themselves. We tend to read biblical narratives primarily for examples of how we should live or what we should avoid doing. We even have a phrase that we use to talk about the main idea that's communicated through a narrative. We call it the moral of the story. But there's really no reason at all to suppose that the theological ideas that are communicated through story have to be limited to ideas about how people should conduct themselves, that is, to morals. As we will see, the Bible uses narrative to communicate serious and very important theological truths. In fact, the Bible uses narrative to communicate some of its most important theological teachings. The ideas communicated through the narrative of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, not only define for us who God is and how he relates to his people, but they're also the foundation for the most important and central of all teachings of the Bible, what Christians call the gospel. The narrative of the gospel writers of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John follow the Torah's example of teaching theological truth in the form of narrative. The evangelists use narrative to show how Jesus of Nazareth fulfills the messianic promises and expectations of the Tanakh. The irony is that we don't even tend to think of these writings in terms of narrative. We tend to think of them as history. I call this an irony because narrative is the literary form in which most of the history of the Bible is presented. So the connection between history and narrative is quite important for anyone who desires to study to understand the Bible. Now, some people attempt to claim that the Bible is not trustworthy as history because its authors have selected and arranged the content of the biblical narratives in order to persuade their readers to accept a particular theological position. But if the selection and arrangement of material for the purpose of communicating one's idea of the meaning or significance of what has happened, if that is not history, then there's no such thing as history. All history writing involves the selection and arrangement of material for the purpose of communicating the author's understanding of the meaning or significance of what has happened. Everyone who reads a history book, everyone who reads a newspaper, everyone who watches the news on television or reads it online needs to understand that. When an author sits down to write a story, whether that story is history or whether it is fiction, The author knows that you can't tell everything that happens to every character in the story. Not only would there be too much information, but most of that information would be irrelevant to what the author was trying to accomplish and would serve no purpose other than to distract the reader. So the author selects certain events and certain conversations that move the story forward in such a way that the reader will understand what happens and why it happens and the significance of its happening. The author then arranges and tells those events and conversations in the way that seems best to him, in order to lead the reader through the process of understanding the significance of what has happened. That's what storytelling is. And that's true whether the story being told is fiction or whether it is history. And since this is true for all narratives, it is certainly also true for biblical narratives. After all, even St. John the Evangelist recognizes the need for selection at the very end of his gospel, when he writes in John chapter 21, "Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." Given that the biblical authors use narrative to express important theological ideas, then understanding how narrative functions is very important if we're going to read biblical narratives with understanding and derive from them the message that the author intended.